Joining us now, member of the Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committees, Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire. Thanks very much for being with us.
Good morning.
I want to get to you on what our response should be to the situation with the Washington Post columnist, Jamal Khashoggi, and how America should be responding. But first, your reaction to the resignation of Nikki Haley and who you'd like to see in that position, which would be related to the next story we're going to discuss.
Well, I was surprised, like so many others, at Ambassador Haley's resignation. I think she's done a good job. I haven't agreed with her on everything, but basically I agree with what your analysis was this morning. I think we need an ambassador to replace her who shares the views that she represented, who understands the importance of the UN, who understands the importance of America in the world, who's going to stand up for human rights and for the values of freedom and liberty for all peoples of the world, and who's going to stand up to dictators. And she did a very good job at that.
Senator, let me ask you about a couple of names that have come up this morning. One is Richard Grenell, obviously an ambassador that's caused some serious problems with our allies, not only in Germany, but across the world. Another one is Dina Powell, who has come from sort of a more traditional wing of not only the Republican Party, but the foreign policy establishment in general in Washington. Do you have a preference between those two?
Well, I'm not going to speak to specifics because I'm not going to speculate on who's going to be nominated. But I think someone who represents that more traditional foreign policy, as Nikki Haley did, is the kind of person that I want to see nominated. And again, someone who understands the importance of standing up for human rights, of standing up to dictators, because too often this White House has sent a mixed message about those issues.
NBC News foreign correspondent Keir Simmons joins us at the table here in New York. Keir, you've been covering this story closely. The details, as reported in the New York Times and Washington Post, are incredibly gruesome. Yeah. There's still allegations at this point. We're reporting the story out. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, well, we have overnight this video that's been broadcast by Turkish television showing Khashoggi walking in to the Saudi consulate. I think one of the real questions about it is why did he go in there? Because this is a man who is very close to senior people in Turkey and has worked with senior people in Saudi. So, you know, he ought to know the risks. It looks as if he feared, but he didn't know. And what does that tell us about the way that Saudi Arabia is continuing to change? The politics there are changing. And then, of course, we have this heartbreaking article in the Washington Post by his fiancée where she says we were in the middle of making wedding plans, life plans. After the consulate, we were going to buy appliances for our new home and set a date. And in that very pertinent, kind of personal account, you see the importance of human rights. I mean, that's what human rights means. It means people's real life. Senator Shaheen, I want to ask you, if you were in the White House or in the State Department, how would you balance the crucial interests for the U.S. of relations with Saudi Arabia with the importance of standing up for human rights? Because it's not straightforward.
Well, this is a reporter, a world-renowned reporter who worked for a prominent newspaper in the United States. He was a legal permanent resident of the United States, operating in a NATO country that is an ally of the United States. It is totally unacceptable what has happened to him, and we need to send a very strong message to the Saudis that we are not going to tolerate this kind of behavior. They do not have a green light to do anything they want. They've been doing that in Yemen in terms of the conflict there. They've been doing that in terms of the relationship with other countries in the Middle East, starting a fight with Qatar, and we need to send a very strong message that this is not acceptable.
But crucially, would you be prepared to effectively jettison vital relations with Saudi Arabia, not least in intelligence in relation to terrorism, for example? Would you be prepared to put all of that aside in the name of those values?
I think we need to look at an escalating list of actions that we can take in response to what the Saudis have done, assuming that that's proved to be true. And as you all suggest, all indications, everything that I've seen raise real questions about what's happened here. There are members of the Foreign Relations Committee who are now looking at potential actions that we can take in Congress to address their behavior, just as we did in Yemen. And we need to send a message to this White House that they need to be strong on these issues, that what has happened here is not acceptable, that we can't condone what dictators are doing, and this is a perfect example of that, and we need to send that message loud and clear.
Senator Noah Rothman, pivoting a little bit to China. Recently, the president of Interpol disappeared only to turn up in Chinese custody. He has submitted his resignation to that organization, presumably under duress. This behavior is unbecoming of a member of Interpol. Should China be suspended from that organization, or should it face other sanctions related to this behavior?
I think they should face sanctions. I haven't seen the background information about what's happened with the head of Interpol, but I think any time a country behaves like a rogue nation and starts arresting individuals, particularly high-profile individuals that have a job to do, that's important to the international community, that the international community needs to take a stand. And this is one of those situations, as is the situation with Saudi Arabia.
Senator Jeanne Shaheen, thank you very much. And
thank you.
We want to mention the active role that you've taken in the fight against America's opioid epidemic. You're hosting an art exhibit on Capitol Hill this week, showcasing paintings of individuals who have died from an overdose. We'll be following that, and thank you very much for shedding light on that situation as well.
Thank you.
Keir, obviously, Saudi Arabia has a very close relationship with this White House, with Donald Trump, with Jared Kushner, especially. And we are connected with Saudi Arabia in many, many ways. At the same time, though, obviously, we just can't turn a blind eye to this. What are our allies in Europe thinking about this right now? What are their concerns, and what do they believe the United States should do?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's kind of the classic Kissinger question, isn't it? You know, how much do you put the interests of America, the diplomatic interests of America first, and how much do you stand up for some fundamental principles which America stands for? Honestly, the answer when it comes to Europe is that Europe is facing so many of its own challenges, not least the very fact of Turkey as a NATO member on its border, with all of the political issues that are playing out there. The world has never needed Washington and America more, Joe, and yet, of course, here you guys are having your own political challenges, and that just kind of sums up how much the politics here is having an effect around the world.
Keir, thank you very much for being on this morning. Good to see you. Coming up, it's expected to be the strongest hurricane to hit the Florida Panhandle on record, and it's now just hours away from landfall. Bill Cairns joins us with the latest track ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.